I don't know how many of you have actually seen Ellis Maxwell before. If you've only listened to the podcast, allow me to introduce Detective Ellis Maxwell, the lead investigator on the Susan Powell investigation.
Thank you.
So, Ellis, I want to quickly, before we jump into these questions, jump back to the first time you and I met. And I remember I asked you to come to KSL, and it was a pretty warm day, and we sat outside, and you were in a full suit, and we started talking. You didn't know me, didn't really know what this podcast thing was that I was talking about, and we chatted for about 2 hours. What was that like for you?
It was hot. It was really hot. It was, as you know, leading up to that, we also had some phone calls as well, and I was hesitant, and
yeah.
I was hesitant in meeting with him and discussing this, and after a couple of phone calls, we met at the studio there and spoke outside, and I didn't know what to expect. I didn't know how this podcast would, how well it would do. I didn't know what to expect as far as questions. I didn't know the direction that he was going to go with the story, and obviously that was a concern of mine.
Yeah.
Because I didn't want it pitched in a bad way, because we did a phenomenal job investigating this case, and for me, and thankfully to Dave and the crew at KSL, they did a great job delivering the story to everybody.
Thanks, Ellis. So we'll jump right into these questions. Thanks, everybody, for your cards. This one is interesting because it's something that I think about myself, and it is, how did covering this case for so long affect you in your personal life?
My personal life, going through, there's a few different parts to that. In the beginning, going through the investigation, it was very difficult because I couldn't discuss what I was experiencing mentally, physically, emotionally, going through this investigation with anybody, except for my peers that was within the investigation team. I could talk to them, and so being amongst my family and friends and the public, I would constantly get questions, and so that was challenging. But moving on after the investigation, there was always questions. People always had questions, and I would do my best to try to answer them so that it kind of gave them an idea as to how it was working this investigation.
Do people stop you, like on the street?
No, I've never been stopped yet, which is good. Because I
can see you getting pulled over now that you're retired, right? Some cop pulling you over and being like, "Hey, I want to talk to you about the Susan Powell case."
They'd probably write me a ticket.
Right.
They'd be like, "Stop it, stop talking to the media."
There's no brotherhood in blue there? You've crossed over?
I don't know, man, I don't know. But yeah, that's a good question, and since the podcast, it's really kind of changed everything.
Yeah.
It's all good.
You
mentioned
it was something you couldn't talk about. Why? Is that typical?
Yeah, for the most part, when you're working a criminal investigation and you're preparing to go to court, you can't be discussing the details of the investigation. If I was talking to, these young ladies down here about a case I was working, who's to say they may be related?
Right.
Right? So then they go and they talk and then, it gets all skewed. It's like the whole plastic cup and the thread in the other cup, and or sitting around a fire and I say something to you, and by the time it gets over here, so it's just not good. It's just not good practice. Yeah. And you got to keep that stuff close to your chest for prosecution.
Okay. I've got another question here. This one is off of Twitter from Brooke, and Brooke wants to know, if Josh was still alive today, would the police prosecute him based off of the circumstantial evidence?
Absolutely. And we wouldn't have prosecuted him today. We would have prosecuted him in 2012, that spring. So, yes, we certainly would have We had the circumstantial evidence for that, and I believe we would have been successful because we had conducted such a thorough investigation, not preventing, but covering up any rabbit holes for defense to go down to sway a jury's mind. So,
And I think the point of this question is some of that circumstantial evidence you had from the very beginning. So I guess explain a little bit to me why that wasn't enough maybe the day of or in those first 48 hours to throw him in a cell at the Salt Lake County Jail.
well, Dave, you're right. There was some really good, solid circumstantial evidence that was collected the day of and throughout that first 2 weeks.
Like the blood on the tile, right? I hear that a lot.
Yeah, so, well, blood on the tile. You have to have a substantial amount of evidence. Not a substantial, you have to have evidence that's going to prosecute. So I think the easiest way to answer this is if we went and took this in front of a judge or a court or a jury, and we had her last will and testament, that we had the blood on the tile, and we had a theory, and we had some of that other circumstantial evidence, I guarantee you that a defense attorney could take this case 1,000 different directions to sway the jury or the judge. There is absolutely no way that he would have been convicted. None. Guaranteed. And I think anybody that researched some past cases where there was even bodies and they got off. I mean, look at Casey Anthony.
Yeah.
She was not charged. Well, she wasn't convicted for killing her kid.
Yeah. So there's a difference between making that arrest based on that circumstantial evidence early on versus a little while down the road when you've had a chance to really vet out all the other possibilities. Am I understanding that right?
Yeah, absolutely. It takes time. You take all of this circumstantial evidence, and I'll tell you that was one of the most hardest things was keeping that last will and testament close to our chest as far as an agency, because this is her writings, and she's very, very descriptive as to where she wants her boys and who's responsible. And it was so difficult to keep that away from the Cox family.
Oh, I can't imagine.
But that was one key piece of evidence that we were going to have to fight to introduce into the court system because it's considered hearsay. So it does take time. And with time, you investigate everything, you eliminate any red herrings, and then when you go to court, all that defense is left with is attacking me personally. And that's it. And that's the only thing that I was really up against when we went to a trial. I drink beer. I would throw my beer cans in my neighbor's garbage can. Yeah. You never know.
Can't even believe you're sitting on this stage right now.
I know. I probably shouldn't. They're going to be coming for me, so.
If this ever plays in another city, they won't get that joke, by the way.
No, they won't. Oh, you know what? It was 6% beer, too, from Wyoming.
Gosh.
Yeah. Not this 3-2 stuff. Oh, wait, we've advanced.
Let's move on, shall we? Another question. Detective Ellis, is there any way for an ordinary citizen to volunteer to assist their local police department in solving cold cases?
I really, really like this question. And my advice is to put together a team of folks in your community and approach your police department with a proposition. Is it possible? Absolutely, as long as you have an open-minded agency and a chief, and understand that you're going to have to sign non-disclosures, you're going to have to mum's the word, right? Like in the Powell case, I couldn't say anything. But the one thing I like about this is it's somebody with a different mindset looking at this case, okay? We talked about this the other day, investigative journalism versus police investigation, and the way we think and the way we process information and the direction we're going to go. But I think this is a great question, and that would be my recommendation. I think it'd be great. brought on, I developed and implemented a college internship program at West Valley after the Powell case, and that's exactly what the interns did. They would come in and they would help us on our cold cases. So it can be done. I don't know if that's still going on at West Valley, if they carried that on, but that's the approach I would take.
Well, and Utah recently created a statewide cold case office, which, as far as am aware, is a first for the state. And I know they have a lot of police departments in cities across the state that are now maybe placing a detective on specifically just cold cases, which when you crowdsource it, right? I mean, all the people that are invested in Susan's story, people who are wanting to go out and do their own searches, right? It tells you that there is a desire to help. It's just finding a way that you can do that without crossing over the legal boundaries.
Right, right. I mean, you have that, and you also have, exposing evidence as well. And then you also have the liability. Like when we were working.
Well, you're not suggesting that somebody would sue a police department if they went out on an investigation and hurt themselves.
Or fell in a mine and then we had to fish them out, yeah. And that's the concern. We just, as far as, I was never an administrator, but that would be my concern, is just the safety.
Yeah.
So.
Okay. I get asked a lot about Josh Powell's hard drives. We, in the podcast, talked a little bit about some of that effort to crack that encrypted drive. And this question, I think, gets to the heart of that. It says the FBI has failed to crack Josh's encrypted drive. Is that a typical occurrence for the FBI? Do you want to throw shade at the
No, I've already done that once. And I didn't catch any slack yet. So now, if the FBI was doing traffic stops, I'd probably be in Quantico locked
They're
up.
booting your car right now, by the way.
So, no, the FBI is great. And, in law enforcement, you have a bunch of different agencies, and we all do different things. But as far as this hard drive, we did provide it to the feds, and they weren't able to access it. And it's understood. And I think at the end of that, it said, is Josh a genius?
Yeah.
Josh was smart. We're all smart in different ways. And if there's one thing that can be learned from that question, is to protect yourselves. I know this kind of is going off topic, but you have to password protect your personal data. And it needs to not be a 4-letter word or a 5-letter word and a number. It needs to be 16, 17, 20, 30 characters. And it needs to incorporate periods and numbers and spaces and lowercase, uppercase. And that's exactly what Josh had done. A 32-bit password that incorporated all of those things, and it makes it virtually impossible to get into.
So somebody out there might be thinking, wait a minute, why is a former cop explaining why we all need to be encrypting stuff? Wouldn't you just encrypt it if you had something to hide?
No, man. We all have personal information. We have personal photos. We have personal financial documents. We have all of these things. I would think to myself, if my computer was hacked and my phone was hacked when I'm at the airport and somebody was able to download all my photos, now they can take all those photos. Not that there's nasty pictures,
right,
but there's family pictures, right? And now they can put those all over the internet, whatever.
So
you don't want that stuff. You've got to protect yourself.
Are you worried that if Josh's hard drive is ever cracked, that the investigator will look at it and find nothing but, photos of him, I don't know, what did Josh do for fun? Racing his RC car.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really hard to say what would be discovered when that is broke, and it very well could just come down to just a copy of his taxes, photographs, stuff like that. There might not be anything on there. Absolutely. And then there could be something on there. But yeah, I have no idea. But, he password protected everything, and it's important to protect your stuff.
One last follow-up on that question. That idea, was Josh some kind of genius? And I'll pose this to you. Did you underestimate Josh?
Um,
Because I did.
You know, going back and reflecting, not going back, but going back and looking at the interviews, like I've watched those interviews time and time and time again. And as I sat and watched that, and as a matter of fact, I just watched a little bit last night because I'm putting together a homicide class, and it came right back to me how I felt about him when I was sitting there trying to be nice with him and try to get him to open up and talk with me and build a rapport. So going to your question, I don't know that, I can't say if I underestimated him or not. I knew that he was, I hate to say the word creep, but he was a creep, and he was a sociopath. I knew he was lying to me, but I didn't have anything on him at that time that I could come back around and kind of grab him by the nape of the neck and be like, you're full of, right?
Baloney. You can say baloney.
Baloney. So
3.2 beer.
now, if I had learned about, the stuff that he, talked about Lori hacking and, all of these other different things, that would have been really, really helpful. But that's the challenge. Going in to these interviews, you've got to do them early. You have to do an interview early because you want to lock them in their story. But then coming back around and kind of doing the interrogation part of it when you never had that opportunity.
Gotcha. Ellis, I want to thank you for taking the time, to be here and for the willingness to answer people's questions. I have really appreciated your candor, and I've learned a lot about police tactics, and this case in particular, through our conversation. So thank you so much.
Yeah, no, thank you. I appreciate it.
All right.
And thank you.
I would like to invite Detective Ellis Maxwell, the lead investigator on the Susan Powell case, onto the stage so we can talk about this. No. Get back here. Have a seat. All right, Ellis. You just heard Chuck
I did.
talking about Josh and this idea that maybe the courts never saw the danger that he was. So let's jump back in time to the first 48 hours of this case, when you first encounter Josh Powell. In fact, let's go into that interrogation room where you have your first shot at really asking him the hard questions. What was that like?
It was just like any other interview, to be honest with you. I didn't really know a lot about Josh or the family other than what I had collected over the course of that day and a half. So I wasn't sure how he was going to respond to my questions, and it's a really careful line. Like you have to be very, very careful, especially now looking back and later in the investigation learning. I mean, he's basically a sociopath. And so trying to keep him, I didn't have enough evidence to go and book him into jail as much as I would like. And I told Mr. Cox that I was going to put him in jail. And I had to later call him back and say, sorry, I can't. But I had to keep him there. And I had to keep him talking, and so he wouldn't get up and walk out. And so that was like the biggest challenge.
So let's play a clip from that interview, because this was all recorded, and I want to get your take on what you see here.
We eat out on kind of a regular basis.
What?
Sometimes we eat out.
Oh, okay.
A little bit more often than we should.
Yeah. Don't we always like that? Eating out always tastes better, don't it?
It kind of does.
Unless we get a bad restaurant.
They usually put enough fat in it that we don't put in it that it's better.
Yeah,
tasting.
exactly.
But it's also cheaper, and sometimes because we go to Del Taco for Tuesday, and we can eat our whole family for $5.
Really? Wow.
$4.70.
Guy's wife has been missing for a day, and the most important thing on his mind is how much he spends at Del Taco.
Do you want to go to lunch tomorrow?
Not at Del Taco.
Bye.
Del Taco's not a sponsor of the show, and apparently they never will be at this point. What in the world? How do you deal with that?
Patience. I mean, what do you do? I mean, I'm sitting there leading up to that. I am talking to him. We're about an hour into this interview right now, up to that point, I think. And I'm talking to him, just trying to learn more about, his hobbies, Susan's hobbies, and corroborate that information with what I learned from the family and friends that I'd spoke to the day before. So essentially, I'm just trying to get that information from him so that I can turn around and use it against him later.
Yeah.
Okay? But the one thing that you'll learn, and you, I think you can support this, is he avoids talking about anything regarding Susan and the important questions. And he really, he'll pause, and then he'll come up and start talking about how he can feed his family for $4.70.
I have to interrupt you because there's another clip that we have ready that I want to share. And this is actually, when you're asking Josh about what Susan likes to do in her free time, and he's talking about, well, she likes to hang out at beauty supply stores. Let's play that beauty supply clip.
Why are you doing this to me?
Have you called any other places where she could be? I mean, have you checked any places where she could be?
I haven't had much of a chance to do any of that yet.
Yeah, he's been busy.
All right. If there were places, if there's places that we need to go check, what places should we go check to see if we can find her?
Beauty supply? I don't think she would be there, but she likes them.
Okay.
Beauty supply?
Okay, so beauty supply, where's that at?
She has so many. Oh, I forgot to mention she's a licensed
It's
cosmetologist
absurd.
in Washington, but not here.
It's
Okay.
ridiculous.
I don't know what beauty supply store she would frequent.
She does go to Sally's. And I don't remember if it's Sally's or a different one on somewhere near Bangor and I think 35th.
Okay.
I think it's right there in Albertsons.
So, you guys obviously raced out to the Sally's.
We
Immediately after the
really,
interview.
that area was checked really, really good. Very frustrating. I mean, sitting here watching this, it aggravates me even just as much now as it did then. Unfortunately, then I couldn't, grab him by his throat and do the things I wanted to do. It's very clear. It was very clear to us at the police department and my peers. At that point when I'm doing this interview, I have, half a dozen of my peers and leadership, watching and listening. And it's that right there, folks, is a quiet,
Tells you everything.
narcissist,
Yeah.
sociopath. These are the most dangerous people. These ones are the most dangerous. And he was the very first person I ever crossed paths with like that.
So we have a stack of question cards
You just
backstage.
threw them all over the place.
No, that's my script.
Oh.
We have a stack of question cards backstage and the tweets that you have all sent in. So we're going to take a quick break, go catch our breath, head out to the lobby. If anything has struck you so far tonight, I just want to point out representatives from the Utah Domestic Violence Coalition are on hand in the lobby and are available to speak with you, and we'll be back in just a few minutes. Thanks, everybody. So apparently they told me backstage, Ellis, that I talked too much, and the first half went really long.
Yeah.
I don't know why they would think a guy who does an 18-part podcast talks too much.
And talks on radio.
Right?
Yeah.
That guy, jeez. We've got some questions. We actually had a stack, literally, I mean, it was a huge stack. So thank you, everybody, for all the questions that you submitted, and we're going to do our best to, I think, hit some good highlights here. Ellis, I'm going to jump right into this because this is one that follows up on something I want to know personally. How's your book coming?
A book? Who mentioned anything about a book?
You did.
It's coming along. It's coming along. It kind of was tabled a little bit. You know, I'm focusing on, I've had a private investigation agency for a couple of years now, Shield Balance. And one of the things that's kind of driving me with that is focusing on domestic abuse and the victims. And I believe that private investigators is a missing piece with these victims. And doing police work for 20 years, I know what I could and couldn't do as a police officer, and I know what I can and can't do now.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
Welcome
anyways.
to life in the private sector, my friend.
I like it.
But that raises the question, did your decision to retire have anything to do with what you went through on this case?
No, it had nothing to do with that. I had an opportunity to potentially promote when I was working this case, and I didn't take that road because I didn't want to. I would have had to give up the case. It was probably like around 2011 or 12.
Okay.
But retiring, that was just me. My whole goal was to go in, do 20 years, get out, and do something else, and be able to help people in a different way. So it had nothing to do with that.
Okay. This is one related to evidence, and it's one that I hear a lot. Why were the food storage bins never opened? So the food storage bins were in the house when you guys went through and searched in December. Josh moved those up to Washington. Were those ever cracked open, do you know?
You know, I can't answer if they were or not. I want to say that they were because they were filled with grain. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, did I personally open them up and look in them? No. But I'm sure that we looked into it. I don't know where that question would come from unless if it's from one of my peers that worked the case and was like, hey, we never checked this.
I think...
Now let's put Ellis on the spot.
That's fair.
I don't know.
If you had one do-over in the case, what would it be?
No do-overs.
No do-overs.
No do-overs. Like I mentioned Tuesday night on the 10 o'clock news, I was asked a similar question by Mike, and you know, this was, though I'm the face of this case, I was surrounded by exceptional investigators. I mean, we had the best investigators working on this case, and we had exceptional leadership. I mean, there were sergeants, lieutenants, captains, deputy chiefs. So, I mean, it wasn't just me. It wasn't just all my decision. We collaborated all the time. Matter of fact, I'll touch on a card that somebody wrote and was like, hey, with you having such little experience, why were you working this case? Well, okay, good question. You know, I'd been 9 years with West Valley at that point, and 14 years altogether in the system. But again, it goes back. Like I had spectacular investigators on this case that really, really poured everything they had into it. They had a lot of experience, and we had great leadership too. So, no do-overs, man. I mean, what this investigation consisted of is, and the time frame, that's what has to be done in a circumstantial, no-body homicide. If we would have took Josh to court in 2010, I guarantee you we would have lost the case.
Okay, so wait a minute, because we have another question. This is actually from a fellow journalist. Came
I
in
like
on
to
Twitter.
talk too, not just
I'll
you.
just cut you off. It's my show.
Okay.
Detective Ellis Maxwell said, if Josh Powell was alive today, they would have arrested him. What was the tipping point? What was different in the circumstantial evidence in December of 2009 compared to February of 2012?
Yeah, I mean, the primary of the circumstantial evidence was collected that first year while we're waiting because the district attorney's office said we have to wait a year, which makes sense, right? I mean, Elizabeth's smart. She surfaced after 9 months, so we get it. But the problem we run into is now we're into 2011, and that's when Susan Powell, in his horrible, disgusting acts surfaced. Michael Powell's car comes to light at this salvage yard, and there's a variety of other things that came up. There was digital evidence that we discovered where he was talking about Topaz Mountain and Rattlesnake, and so we have all of these things that kind of surfaced in 2011 that we had to address. If we didn't address them, I guarantee the defense attorney, and I'll tell you what, the defense attorney had was a great defense attorney.
Right.
So
you brought up Michael. I personally remember when Michael took his own life. I was at work.
So do I.
At KSL. I wouldn't imagine why you would. I was at work. I was on the news desk, and we got this report out of Minneapolis that somebody had jumped from a parking garage, and that person was Michael Powell. And it took us a minute to kind of connect the pieces there. And it was this question for me, like, who? Who is this guy? How is he involved? Yeah, he's a member of the family, but we never heard about him. I learned a lot doing the podcast, but one of the questions that we received was about Michael and the probability of him being involved in disposing of Susan's body. Do you think he had a part?
no.
Okay, why? Why?
There's a possibility. There is some possibility that when he came down to Utah from the state of Washington and met up with Josh, that they could have went and relocated her body. That's very probable. But it's so risky. It's so risky. And another thing is, let's go back to Josh's interviews, okay? This is a guy clearly that is responsible for his wife's disappearance, okay? And you guys have seen small clips here and there. Some may have went online and saw some longer clips, but he's too calm, he's too collected, and he's too confident. So that tells me that he disposed of her body in a fashion that he knew that nobody's going to find her. So I kind of fall back onto that, and I don't think that they did that.
So in some cases, it's not so much what Josh said as what he didn't say and how he acted that kind of informs how you read him.
Yeah, it's real. Those folks are hard. They're a sociopath, they're habitual liars. And so, I could be completely wrong. And I have peers that I worked with on the case that believe that they relocated the body together. And that very well could have happened. I don't know. Okay. Nobody knows.
So I don't know if you saw a little show on cable a couple weekends ago that I watched, and they seem to imply that Steve Powell might have had a hand. What do you think?
Are you trying to get these guys all mad at me? No.
I might be throwing shade on a competitor.
No.
So Steve Powell, right? With everything else that we have learned about Steve,
right?
Why not?
Well, this is my theory, is we've seen throughout the podcast and throughout all the film that's came out on Steve, and it makes me sick every time we talk about him or even put his face up there, but he had such an infatuation with her that I think he would probably have murdered Josh if he learned that Josh was responsible for Susan's disappearance. There's a different connection there between Steve in his mind with Susan and that connection between Josh and Steve, but there is absolutely nothing that supports that he...
Steve didn't like Josh much. From reading his journals, that was my takeaway.
Right.
Josh was a huge disappointment as far as Steve was concerned.
Yeah.
And I think for Steve, taking Susan away from Josh would have been the ultimate, feed into his narcissism.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think about that?
Yeah, I don't like it.
Yeah. I don't like
But
it.
I'm like an evidence-based,
Right, right.
I mean, there's just nothing there. I mean, obviously, we climbed all over Steve. We went everywhere. We read all of his journals. I mean, some of the poor guys, my peers, that had to sit and watch his videos and read his stuff, they'd come to me and, I mean, they need therapy.
Legit. No,
I mean,
that's
it's
serious.
horrible.
That's serious.
And so, yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, I'll admit this, at the end of the day, anything is possible with anybody. Going through police work and going through my life, when people do things that are just crazy bizarre, it's like, what's new? What's next? I mean, you just never know.
Yeah.
And, but I just don't believe. I think Josh was very confident. He was very quiet. He kept it all close to himself. And if he did share any information, it was with Michael, and it was probably limited. I would think Michael would probably be like, okay, it's enough. I don't want to hear no more. Because here's Mike that's going through a PhD program, former military, right? So if there's anybody that knew anything, it was Michael, and a combination of his knowledge and Josh doing what he did is what pushed Michael to do a swan dive.
I want to conclude with one question that I know you already answered in the podcast, but I'll ask it again because I personally go back and forth on it when people ask me, and it's that question of whether or not you think Susan will ever be found.
It's a really, really difficult question, and I go back to my answer. I mean, I hope she is, for the benefit of the family, because that I would never wish upon a worse enemy. And it would be remarkable. I hope she is. Will she ever? I don't know. Again, they had the search just recently out in the West Desert. They invited me to that search. I declined. We as an agency, not just me by myself, but we as an agency and other agencies that assisted, we searched and searched and looked and followed up on everything and found nothing. And going back again to his interviews and everything that we've learned about him, he just comes across as being very confident and it's just a sickening cocky that, hey, you're not going to find her. And so, I mean, I hope she is. I hope that, I have no idea where anybody should go look. I mean, we looked everywhere that we thought of looking. And so, that's all we have is hope.
Yeah. Ellis, thank you so much for being willing to come and answer all these questions.
Thank you.
Okay. There are some questions that I think would be more appropriate to bring to an expert who focuses specifically on domestic abuse. I can tell you, since we launched the Cold Podcast, I have had countless messages from people who have shared their experiences with me. They've asked my advice on what they should do when they have a loved one who is in an abusive situation. And I have to admit, I do not feel qualified to answer those questions. Certainly, I feel a responsibility to help. And so that's why I turned to Jennifer Oxborrow and the Utah Domestic Violence Coalition for this particular insight. So I'd like to welcome Jennifer to the stage. Thanks for coming, Jennifer.
Hello.
All right, we have some questions from the audience, but before we get to those, let me put that to you. I don't feel qualified. And when somebody asks me that question, what should I do? What should I tell my friend? What should I tell my sister? I almost go blank. And then I say, well, you should probably contact somebody from the Utah Domestic Violence Coalition. What happens when somebody calls the statewide link line?
So the Domestic Violence Coalition is a statewide organization, and we've been around for about 30 years. So there's a coalition and organization like us in every single state and territory. So no matter where people are, they can always find help through their state coalition. And the state coalition in Utah is separate from the Sexual Assault Coalition. So there's also a Sexual Assault Coalition. So you have two options here. When you call our hotline, those calls are answered by a professional victim advocate. And those advocates are trained in over 40 hours of crisis response. We call our hotline the link line because it links people back to programs and resources in their community. Anybody that you talk to on that hotline has really high levels of confidentiality protection under the Violence Against Women Act, under HIPAA and 42 CFR. So these are federal laws that help provide for the confidentiality.
I don't have my federal code, but I'll trust you on this.
Yeah, so it's not discoverable. In fact, it's completely confidential. You can reach out to us 24/7 and talk to someone in over 100 different languages. And they'll listen to you, they'll help you crisis and safety plan, they'll help you find resources if you need emergency shelter or help getting a protective order. And a lot of people, because this is so complicated, they'll reach out to someone that they know or trust, and that person often doesn't know what to do. So referring them back to that hotline where they can get that next level of help and do what they're ready to do. That's really important, to work with someone where they're ready to begin.
What if I am the person who has that friend or has that family member who's going through it? Can I also call the line and say, hey, look, I need advice on how to even talk to that person?
Absolutely. We collectively, our programs that our statewide coalition represents, we provide over 100,000 nights of emergency shelter per year. And we also collectively answer over 40,000 crisis calls every year. And a lot of those calls come from people who are, worried about someone that they care about, a sister, a neighbor. We also take calls from professionals, from lawyers, from judges, from advocates and librarians and hairdressers. People who are worried and don't know how to start the conversation can call us and talk to an advocate, and we can help you approach that conversation, because it's a difficult thing to bring up.
Yeah.
And it can be really embarrassing for someone to
Yeah.
start to talk about it.
Yeah, and I think we see that with Susan's story in the sense that her friends seem to be aware that she was considering divorce, say,
Right.
or that she would explain, hey, I don't have the money to go out for lunch because Josh makes me eat canned chili.
Right.
But she never really gave anybody the full story. And my read on that is that sense of embarrassment probably played a role.
Sure, and it's really easy to miss some of the signs of abuse. We use the term domestic violence a lot, Dave, and I think that can really miss the mark sometimes. I work as a therapist also, and often I'll ask people if they're safe at home, and they'll tell me, sure. And, no one's hitting me or kicking me or slapping me or punching me. But then I ask, do you have the ability to go out and meet your sister for lunch? No, my husband's really controlling. And we use terminology like husband, wife. Overwhelmingly, domestic violence and abuse is perpetrated by a husband or a man against a woman. But it can happen to anyone, and our programs serve everyone.
This question, I think, cuts at the heart of what we saw with Susan's case. And it's, what if a woman thinks she can't leave an abusive situation because of her kids? What should she do?
We get this question all the time. It really depends. So Utah implemented something called the Lethality Assessment Protocol 3 years ago. Any of our advocates on our hotline, advocates across the state, and over 60 law enforcement agencies in Utah now use 11 evidence-based questions to help people understand what level of risk they're at. So these are questions that are most predictive of intimate partner homicide risk. Susan would have scored very high. So if someone has children, that can be an additional risk factor because it can be another point of contention in an abusive, violent relationship. But it really depends on what that person is ready and willing to do. We get asked all the time, why did she stay? Why did she put up with that? I know that's come up in this case a lot too. And a lot of times it's because people are trying to survive and they really know their situation better than anyone. So it just depends. But all of our programs have children's advocacy support as well. We can help people with counseling and safety planning around kids and navigating complicated custody situations as well, which can be a really dangerous situation for people.
I'm glad you brought up the why did she stay question. And not just in this specific case, but I think it's one that we see in our culture asked a lot. And what I've taken away from studying Susan's situation is, well, it's complicated.
Right.
And maybe that seems like a cop-out, but maybe my question here for you then is it possible for someone who's in an abusive situation to love and care for the person who is putting them through that abuse?
Yeah, we're all capable of emotional multitasking, right? How many of you have had children? It's hard, right? Yeah,
I've been a child. I know how much trouble I was for my parents.
Yeah, but in all seriousness, you know, that happens a lot where people, most of the survivors that we talk with, they just want the abuse to stop. They do love this person, and it's a really abnormal type of crime, right? Where someone that you love and trust, someone you've started a family with perhaps, someone that you have joined your life to, someone that knows you in many ways better than anyone else is also hurting you. So it can be very confusing for people, and there can be a lot of guilt and shame with that. And that question, why does she stay, is the wrong question. We should be asking why someone's hurting someone. We shouldn't be asking why someone stays.
The first time you said that to me, it was, right? Mind blown. And you and I have talked about this.
Yeah.
I took a moment after you said that to go, how many people in my own personal past, people I've dated, might look back and say, yeah, that Dave guy, he was a real jerk. And
He's pretty nice. He's a pretty nice guy.
But it was a moment for me to say, I need to be cognizant of not just the way I think I'm acting, but maybe the way I'm perceived by somebody else.
Right.
And that was very, that was almost an epiphany, I would say.
Yeah. I've worked clinically with a lot of people who've perpetrated violence and abuse, and they're court-ordered to come see a therapist for an intervention program. And a lot of times they don't realize that. You see the light bulb go off, where they're like, oh, well, I never hit anyone, I never kicked anyone, but I didn't let her have access to our finances. She had a curfew. She was only allowed to spend so much at the grocery store. I told her that she would never see the kids again if she left. These are very real aspects of domestic abuse as well, psychological, emotional abuse, and also sexual violence is a really tough part of domestic violence and abuse to talk about, and that's very common in these situations as well.
Well, I so much appreciate what you have done with the Cold Podcast in giving people the permission to talk about it, because I honestly believe that is where we all begin in making a change in our culture, is taking away that shame, taking away that embarrassment, and looking out for one another.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for inviting the partnership. We know that this is an issue that we can solve. We're never going to eliminate all of these cases, but I know through partnership we can do more, and we can see our domestic violence homicide rates in particular decrease in Utah through this type of partnership and teamwork, so thank you.
Well, thank you, Jennifer. Really quickly, before I let you go,
Sure.
because I think this is a very important question. How do you protect someone in an abusive situation if they can't get a restraining or protective order? And I've heard it said a lot that, hey, a restraining order, that's just a piece of paper.
Yeah.
And going to court and getting that piece of paper, in some cases, seems like it doesn't do any good until, unfortunately, somebody has been attacked, has been killed. Mm-hmm. So what would you say to that?
I think the research shows that working with a professionally trained victim advocate reduces your risk of reassault by up to 65%. So that's really helpful, right? So when someone comes to you, you're gonna say three things. You're gonna say, I believe you, I'm sorry this happened, and how can I help? And you don't need to know the whole wide network of resources and how to navigate getting a protective order or a stalking injunction or what the difference is. You just need to know one number. So if you reach out to the hotline 24/7, we can help people navigate all of that. I think people really, it takes a lot, and we don't know that they haven't come forward and asked for help before. So again, avoiding that victim blame. How did you get yourself into this situation? Why are you putting up with it? I would never have let that happen. Avoid all of that, stay out of judgment, know where to turn for help, and help people know that they can talk to you and that you're glad that they trust them and you believe them.
All right, Jennifer, thank you so much. I want to point out before we let Jennifer off the stage here that there are people out in the lobby right now who are willing and ready to take additional questions if you want to know about resources to help someone who's in an abusive situation. This information obviously is freely available to anybody who would call or go on the website, and statistically speaking, odds are there's somebody in this audience right now, probably more than one.
Yeah, it's 1 in 3 women in Utah are affected by domestic violence in their lifetime. So we all know someone.
So, and if tonight is not the night, if this is not the venue, would just encourage you to, if you're in that situation, please reach out for help. Jennifer, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. I never expected when I set out to tell this story in a podcast that people would come to me to share their own stories and tell me how Susan's example had influenced them to leave an abusive situation. And I still don't really know the best way to respond when people reach out to me for advice, because I'm the first to tell you I am not an expert when it comes to escaping domestic violence. So I need to bring Jennifer Oxborrow from the Utah Domestic Violence Coalition onto the stage to help provide that perspective. Jennifer? Thanks for coming, Jennifer.
My pleasure. Hello, everyone. Wow, there are a lot of you.
It's also very bright.
It is. I'm kind of glad.
We have some questions, but before we get to that, help me understand. There's a statewide link line, a telephone number 24/7 that people can call if they are in a situation where they need help. What happens when someone calls that line?
Right. Thanks for asking, and thanks so much for your partnership. You've just done such an amazing job with this podcast and really helped to raise awareness so much. So I get the honor of leading the statewide coalition, the Utah Domestic Violence Coalition. And one of the things that we do is we run a 24-hour domestic violence hotline. We call it our link line. So that's that 1-800-897-LINK. We call it that because we're trying to link people back to resources in their community. And in Utah, we have some pretty serious limitations in our system of care. Our state legislature only recently started contributing to the cost of those services, and our community-based programming is pretty sparse. But we can always find help for someone. If you reach out to us, a professionally trained advocate answers that call 24/7, completely confidentially. You don't even have to tell us your name. Anyone can call. If you're worried about someone and you don't know how to start a conversation, or if you're the person who is actually experiencing the violence or abuse, or if you're someone who's perpetrating violence and abuse and you're looking to change your life, reach out to us, you can talk to us, and we'll link you back to resources in your community.
So do you actually hear phone calls from people on the link line saying, I don't like the way I'm acting, like coming from more the abuser side?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's one of the things that you did really well in the Cold podcast was you showed various examples of that intergenerational effect, right? So a lot of times people will grow up in a violent home or they see abuse, they see control and coercion, and they start to adopt some of those behaviors. And that doesn't mean that that always happens, but we know from research that when you grow up around violence and abuse and control, you're more likely to enter into a relationship where some element of that is present. So sometimes people will call and really recognize that they're in an unhealthy situation and they want to change.
You told me a statistic early on in our conversations about this case. And simply put, that's 1 in 3. What is that all about?
Right, so about 4 years ago when I took over this role, we knew that we had a really big job and not enough money to do it. We wanted to expand services, so we only have 13 programs serving 29 counties in Utah. That's abysmally low. Most other states have 40 or 50 programs. We only have 13. So I was trying to figure out where to focus our efforts. And we started looking at the Centers for Disease Control, who helped us understand that in Utah, 1 in 3 adult women will experience domestic violence and abuse, stalking, and or sexual violence in her adult lifetime perpetrated by a current or former intimate partner. So that's not verbal abuse. That's not emotional abuse. This is the worst of the worst. And we're higher than the national average. So about 1 in 4 nationally will experience that. In Utah, it's 1 in 3. And one thing that's exceptionally high here is our intimate partner homicide rate. So just like the things we've been talking about with the Cold podcast tonight, domestic violence homicide in Utah, some years it's almost half of our homicides. And we know that we can do more. So we're working with a team of partners to try to address that.
So 1 in 3, I think about how many women are in the audience right now. How many people are hearing this
Right.
and could use that help?
Right.
That's stunning.
Yeah, and it's a difficult conversation to have. It's very embarrassing to people sometimes. People usually just want the abuse to stop. So it's very abnormal, right, to trust someone and love someone and invite them into your life and share your secrets and your dreams and your children sometimes with them, and then to have that person hurt you. That's an abnormal situation, and people often go very, very quiet and private about it, and it can be difficult to reach out. So if someone reaches out, you need to know what to do.
Yeah. I want to take a couple questions here. This was a card that came in specifically for you. And I'll read this verbatim. It says, how do you help a woman who is in a controlling situation, but she's brainwashed by her husband? And this is signed, not allowed to see my daughter for 10 years.
Oh, it's heartbreaking. Well, that's an example where the person that wrote this, I hope you'll reach out to us or to a professionally trained victim advocate who can help you and support you. I think the most important thing you can do is to try to stay connected to that person, because what an abuser will do, first and foremost, they start trying to isolate someone and they start trying to limit their contact with other people. So whatever you can do to stay connected to that person and make sure that you are there and that they trust you, that you're telling them that you believe them, that you understand, and you're staying out of judgment. So avoid that question, why do you stay? Why did you get yourself into this? Really refrain from that and just have an open mind and an open heart and tell people that you know how to find help.
I mean, we saw this with Susan, the way that Josh cut her off
Right.
from her family. I mean, I don't know what stuck out to you, but for me, the move to Utah was meant to be an escape, but it also ended up serving as a way for Josh to really kind of control who Susan interacted with.
Right, and that's primary for an abuser. They want to maintain power and control. That's what this is all about. Even someone who's very narcissistic, as he was in many ways, also narcissists typically struggle a lot with insecurity. So he wants to have control over her, he wants to limit her interactions with people, and those forms of abuse can be really difficult to see. So financial abuse, even sexual violence and abuse that happens within the context of a marriage or relationship can be really difficult to talk about for someone who's trying to survive that. So just appreciate that if someone's reaching out to you, it's because they trust you. You're going to want to tell them that you believe them and that you want to help them do whatever they're ready to do.
You made reference to this kind of in passing a moment ago, so I want to take a moment to just go into it a little more. And it's this idea, this question, how do you manage victim blaming? And is this something that you ever catch yourself doing?
You know, it's one of the things, again, that I appreciated about your approach to journalism with this, is you sat down with us and said, this is so complex, help us understand how we can do this in a way that doesn't cause blame or shame and really helps people understand and maybe recognize certain aspects that may be happening in their life or in someone that they care about their life and where to turn for help. Victim blame usually comes up when people are really, really emotional about something and they're struggling to know what to say. So the best thing that you can do is to come from empathy, stay out of judgment, and just say, I'm so glad you told me this. I may not know exactly what to do for you, but I'm with you, and I appreciate you trusting me, and I'm here to help you figure this out.
We have one more question, time
Sure.
for one more question, I should say. And this, I think, is very important because it gets to the heart of many situations. How do you protect someone who is in an abusive situation if they're not able to get a restraining or protective order?
So we just did some research with the Department of Health data and found that in a 5-year trend that we studied, victims of intimate partner homicide in Utah in that 5-year window, less than 2% of them had a protective order at the time of their murder. And that tells me that protective orders can be challenging for people to get, and that oftentimes we hear it's just a piece of paper. But what it is, and what law enforcement officers will tell you, what courts and victim advocates will tell you, is that it's a way to start coordinating a team of support around someone. So if you can help someone to gain access to a professional victim advocate, we know that their risk of reassault goes down significantly. Some studies would say as much as 65%. And they can help someone navigate that process of getting a protective order. But the most important thing you can do is start by believing. Just listen to that person, try to understand, and always call 911 if someone's in danger. Really try to reach out to a professional victim advocate. If you're not ready to call law enforcement, all of our programs across the state will help you whether you've reached out to law enforcement or not. That can be a challenging part.
When I looked through all of the background of what was going on inside Josh and Susan's house, and all of what appeared to be Susan's awareness of her situation being a bad one, but also her acknowledgement that Josh hadn't really, he hadn't really knocked her around.
Right.
Is that a challenge when somebody like that contacts law enforcement because you don't have that evidence in a way to prove that you have been abused?
So just like our resources have been limited and somewhat antiquated in Utah for a long time, we're starting to change that. We're also starting to change some of our laws and some of our policies. And so if you know your legislators, reach out to them, thank them for making change, tell them that we want to see those laws get stronger. But Detective Maxwell talked about that. There's a real limitation sometimes in what law enforcement can do or what our prosecutors can do. And that's for good reason. We want to make sure that it isn't too easy to accuse someone of that, but it can make it difficult to gather evidence and to prosecute these crimes. So we're always looking for feedback on how we can advocate for better policy too, better statutes and better safety overall in our communities.
And that protocol that you train law enforcement on
Yes.
is so important.
Yes, I think we have one of our primary champions here, Chief Greg Butler, brought the Utah lethality assessment protocol forward. We implemented a model from Maryland, and he helped us work with law enforcement. We've trained over 60 law enforcement agencies across the state now to use a standardized approach. These are 11 risk factors that are most predictive of intimate partner homicide risk, and it really helps us to all literally get on the same page and wrap up a team of support for somebody who's in the most danger.
And how many of those boxes did Susan check?
Susan would have met almost all of the most risky criteria. Not all of them, but almost all.
Enough.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I wish we had had this in place when this happened.
Jennifer, thank you.
Thank you.
I hope we help some people.
You have so much. Thank you.